Hello and welcome to the IFT trade show in Chicago, where I caught up with Ben Goldacre, who has made a career out of exposing bad science in the industry and in the media. I've been coming to the IFT show for years. There's always a lot of hand-wringing from food scientists about how ill-informed the public is about food science. But aren't food companies themselves directly contributing to consumers' mistrust of science by pandering to ignorance about chemicals, using phrases like no bad stuff, no hairy chemicals in our products, our food is made in the kitchen, not a lab? Should they take some responsibility?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you use pseudoscience as a device, as a rhetorical device, as a tool or a marketing device, then you create an environment, you foster an atmosphere of permissiveness around misuse of scientific evidence. So it's inevitable that it will come back to bite you on the bum. And that kind of should be obvious. I think it probably is obvious. I think it's one of those situations where with each small individual opportunity to misuse science, the temptation is so great that you think, well, I'll just do it on this occasion because it'll help me sell this one thing. And then the cost is borne by the whole of society, or at least the whole sector. And that's something that people have to deal with, but also, I think, own and take responsibility for.
So I want to ask you about confirmation bias. Now, people often cite scientific data when it's consistent with their worldview or with their politics, but they ignore it or they mistrust it when it doesn't fit with their worldview. So you may have people who they believe the science behind climate change, but they may be suspicious of science around GMOs or vaccines. And do you agree with that, and what can we do to counter this?
Well, it's absolutely true, of course, and we're all vulnerable to it, and there's lots of really good evidence showing that if you show people, for example, people with different intuitions about the value of gun control, for example, if you show them before and after data, or comparing one state with another state data, and then invite them to say whether or not they agree with the findings, they will pick holes with the study design that goes against their prejudice and warmly accept the results from the study design that reinforces their prejudice. So there are various protective strategies that have been developed over the years to try and hold off this kind of bias. The most obvious is a systematic review. So a systematic review is really a piece of science about how you look for, assess and summarise evidence. So you say exactly how you're going to search for the information. You say up front which study designs you think are good or bad. You say up front what criteria you'll be using to grade the shortcomings and the biases in the data, and then you go out and find the data and you fit it into that template, really.
What about the role of the media in this? Is there a tendency in the media to try and present two sides of an argument? So even if the overwhelming consensus of scientific opinion is on one side and 500 studies support one thesis, and there's one study, perhaps not a very good study, suggesting a different point of view, in the media you will have two talking heads and one will represent each point of view. Is that a helpful way for the media to handle?
Yeah, of course. It's a completely ridiculous way to manage scientific discourse, and you see it in extremists around things like vaccines. So here's a perfectly sensible person who will give a faithful account of the evidence, and then here is a completely crazy person who's going to cherry pick and tell very emotive stories.
And they'll have equal weighting in that news interview. And
they'll both have equal airtime and equal weighting. I think it's important to realise, though, that a lot of the time people who work in public engagement and pop science are collaborators in that process. So obviously nobody in America knows who I am. In Britain I am a kind of D-list public intellectual, and I'm often asked onto the radio and telly to talk about stuff. And actually when you're in that position, when you're at that end of the telescope, you can see really clearly how those head-to-head, rather childish, kind of pantomime-ish discourses are created. So not very long ago I was rung up by somebody who said, oh hi, are you free to come on, I won't say the name of it, but flagship current affairs discussion show to discuss cannabis. We've got somebody who says that they think cannabis is really dangerous and really bad for you and causes schizophrenia, but we'd like somebody who says that cannabis is harmless. Would you like to be that person? And I said, well, no, because that's not what I think. I mean, I think, there's some evidence, and I can talk about what the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence on harms are, and I can put that in the context of the prevalence of schizophrenia more generally. But overall, obviously, I'm not going to be the person who goes, "Hey, cannabis is completely fine." That would be a ludicrous position for anyone to take. To which they replied, "Thank you very much for your time. I'll get back to you."
No thanks. Yeah.
But what's nice is that then the next day, the piece went out, and I saw the person who said yes to the same offer. And she said exactly what she had been asked to say.
Okay, so let's sort of give me some parting advice, as you like, as a journalist. A new study comes out saying eating product or ingredient X could reduce your risk of cancer or disease Y. How do we place this in context? When we're on a deadline, we've got 45 minutes to churn out something, and we want to be as responsible as we can within 45 minutes. So what do we do?
So firstly, just very specifically on the thing of, does this food stuff cause or prevent cancer? Honestly, there is no need for any more stories like that. They are of almost no value. These come from studies which are the weakest form of evidence, generally. They come from observational data which is hopelessly subject to confounding and bias, and there's almost always a very, very, very long history of endless findings that are reciprocally conflicting. So one week, coffee causes cancer, the next week, coffee prevents cancer. I think firstly you have to interrogate, is it really helpful or informative or useful or interesting for you to write something like that at all? And that's actually one of the most difficult pieces of and most annoying pieces of advice that somebody who cares about science can give to somebody who wants to cover science. So, for example, in a national newspaper, you often find the best science editor is the one that really irritates the news desk by preventing them from writing stupid stories, and that's quite an unwelcome presence in a newsroom. I think also, though, if you feel that you've got to do it, and people often say, "Well, I had to cover it because everybody else was covering it," there is nothing wrong. In fact, there's probably a lot of clicks to be had in being the person who covers it and says why it's probably nonsense. So, for example, you could put this latest finding on does X cause or prevent cancer, this bizarre ongoing philosophical project of dividing all the inanimate objects and food ingredients in the world into the ones that either cause or prevent cancer. You can put it in context and say, well, firstly, if you can find one quickly, a systematic review of the literature, which looks at what people have found before.
Sure.
It's actually quite a good test of a scientific researcher if you say, you've reported this one study that says that this fruit or vegetable is associated with an increase or a decrease in cancer. Can you point me to a systematic review, a systematic overview of all of the studies that have ever been done on this question? And if they can't, if they've published a scientific paper on whether something is associated with cancer, and they can't point you to a systematic review of all of the studies of the same kind that have been done before, then they are probably not a good researcher. So that's actually quite a good diagnostic test of the researcher in question.